Good morning, everybody. I, after this morning's very engaging exchange over break, I looked at my presentation and I threw it in the trash because everything has already been said, especially about China. But I will still talk a bit more about China because China deserves special attention for all of us who look at Africa carefully, for all of us who are interested in the security and development of Africa. But I will extend the conversation beyond China to include Russia and India. My brother from Portugal was saying in the morning that they were invaded by Brazil, so I'll ask him to deal with Brazil. And the S in the BRICS, I'm not going to deal with it because it's already in Africa. Let me identify what I think are some of the key drivers of BRIC engagement in Africa. First and foremost, resource security. This is the reason why the BRICS or the BRIC are in Africa. It's not, Africans got very beautiful eyes, but let me disappoint you. This is not the reason why foreign powers are there. It's first and foremost because of resource security. Closely connected to that is the issue of Africa being the new frontier or the last frontier as far as the global economy is concerned. Africa is the one area where new markets are available, very rich investment opportunities are available. So that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of people, a lot of partners coming back to Africa. The other driver of this engagement is what's being called symbolic diplomacy. Everybody wants to invite the Africans for a forum of this, a forum of that. The Russians have a forum? Yeah, they got a forum. The Chinese have a forum. The Indians have a forum. The Japanese have a forum. The Europeans have a forum. Everybody wants to be seen with the Africans. That's symbolic diplomacy. There's some substance to it, but by and large, the symbolism trumps just about everything else. The other driver is development assistance and cooperation. Countries are betting on Africa. A lot of countries are betting on Africa, and they want to genuinely assist Africa fulfill its great potential. There's also the pursuit of strategic partnerships. Strategic partnerships. Certainly, the United States, my government, wants strategic partnerships in Africa. We're pursuing them. So to me, well, it makes perfect sense that China would also do the same, and Russia would also do the same. India would also do the same. Others would also do the same. So these are the drivers, from my perspective, of foreign engagement in Africa today. So let me focus on China for a few minutes, if you allow me. Well, from my perspective, the reason why China is so appealing to African countries, to African societies, is very simple and straightforward. China provides an alternative model. China provides an alternative development model. Africa has followed several other models in the past. Some African countries tried the Soviet model. Did not work very well. Some countries tried the Western model. Did not work very well. But now they're looking at China. China, when African countries started gaining their independence, China was at the same level of development. Where is China now? China has gone through a very rapid economic expansion. Economists like myself are completely flabbergasted at the rate of economic expansion. 10, 20, well, reaching 20% sometimes. Average about 12 to 15% over a whole generation. Unprecedented, completely unprecedented. And that rapid economic expansion did not produce the kind of upheaval that rapid economic expansion usually produces in societies. So you have on the one hand rapid economic expansion, and on the other hand strong government, stability. This is very appealing to the Africans. The Africans want to develop very rapidly, but they at the same time want stability. But there are also some tangible benefits to this relationship. A couple of points to make here. First of all, Africans are very leery of conditions and conditionalities. Whether or not those conditions and conditionalities are well intended, Africans tend to hesitate. China provides economic partnership with no strings attached. No strings attached. You want $1 billion? Here's $1 billion. In fact, sometimes the African country goes to Beijing and says, well, I need $1 billion. China says, no, you need $2 billion. So there are tangible benefits. There are tangible benefits because China is allowing Africa to extract its resources, is allowing Africa to pursue important infrastructure development projects. Well, we can talk about the quality of those projects. Sometimes, oftentimes, the roads do not withstand those good, heavy African rains. Be that as it may, the roads are being built. The airports are being built. The ports are being built, and so on and so forth. Agriculture, others. But just look at the extraordinary growth in bilateral trade between China and Africa. 2000, the value of that bilateral trade stood at $10 billion. Where is it today? Anybody know? Where is it today? 175. It's incredible. It's incredible. 10 billion in 2000, 170 plus today. Well, but not everybody's happy about the Chinese in Africa. Not everybody's happy. A lot of people, Mbeki's brother has been asking the question, is this a new form of colonialism? He's asking the question, is this a new form of colonialism? We can help him answer that question, and I hope we do. But what we also see on the ground is some tension that we neglect at our own peril. There's a tension between, well, this, you go, every time when I go to Africa, especially when I go to Angola, visit, relatives, doesn't matter. Going through Johannesburg or Addis, doesn't matter. The planes are full of Chinese. Sometimes 75%, 80%. I said, where are my brothers? My brothers are not flying anymore. They're being crowded out of the planes by the Chinese. Where are all these Chinese going? Where are all the Chinese going? I got a minute to tell you a story. So, before my mom passed away, I went to visit her. I come from the Central Highlands of Angola, devastated by the war. So I go visit my mom, and there was this Chinese leaning against the wall of the house. I said, Mom, what's going on here? What is this guy doing here? You got Chinese friends now? She said, well, they're fixing the, the sewage. I said, you gotta be kidding me. You're fixing the sewage, we cannot fix our own sewage anymore? Anyway, I threw my hands up in the air. But there is a tremendous influx of Chinese in Africa. And, economists talk about the crowding out effect. Pay attention to that. The crowding out effect. The Chinese are there pursuing their own business objectives. What are the African entrepreneurs doing? I go to Luanda, the Chinese are selling trinkets. The Chinese they're basically taking over all of the small businesses. Well, how long will it be before the Angolans start asking some very hard questions? So when we talk about China, we need to look at the positives, but we also need to balance that with some real tension that's beginning to brew there. And yourselves, as the next generation of African security leaders, need to pay attention to this. If this trend continues in 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to have a real challenge in our hands. And we're going to deal with it one way or another. Let me deal with Russia in the next few minutes or so. Russia, for much of the Cold War, was one of the main players on the African continent. And if in the 1970s, and indeed early 1980s, if you to plot a trajectory, you probably guess that Russia would be a very important player in Africa in the 21st century. That has not happened. It has not happened. Russia was on the side of Africa during the anti-colonial struggle. It goes back, Russia's engagement in Africa, in fact, goes way back to the mid-1950s. If you think back to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they mention as one of their key objectives, an important objective, the collapse of the colonial system of imperialism, as they called it. So was for Russia an important strategic objective to help the Africans gain their independence, because from from that perspective, that was facilitating, that was speeding up the collapse of the colonial system of imperialism. You will also recall that the Soviet Union supported Egypt during the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. We're studying history about the close relationship between the former Soviet Union and Patrice Lumumba, one of the greatest heroes of Africa's liberation. The close relationship between the Soviet Union and the MPLA in Angola. Angola's president, in fact, is a graduate of a university in the former Soviet Union. Well, he's not the only one. The Soviet Union trained hundreds, if not thousands, of young Africans throughout much of the 1960s and the 1970s and 1980s. What happened? Why is it that we don't see Russia in Africa with the kind of strength one would anticipate it? The end of the Cold War. Russia lost the Cold War, while the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, and the leaders who took over Russia after the end of the Cold War basically disengaged from Africa. Africa was not important anymore. Africa was, in many ways, an orphan. The re-engagement happened with Putin. The re-engagement happened with Putin. Putin comes to power, and he basically feels that his position will be strengthened on the international scene if he sided himself with Africa. So, before he was expelled from the G8, credit to Putin for placing Africa consistently on the G8 agenda. Now, there's some engagement in Africa right now on the part of Russia. There's some Russian firms there. Africa is supplying some raw materials to Russian firms. Gazprom, the big Russian energy company, heavily involved in places like Algeria. I believe they're about to start a $10 billion gas pipeline between Nigeria and Algeria. There's some involvement. There's some presence of Russia in Africa. In the area of military assistance, they're especially strong. You realize that some of the biggest militaries in Africa were supplied by Russian hardware, military hardware. And the Russians have also been very, very instrumental in terms of relieving Africa of some of its debt. Recall, I think it was back in 2008, President Putin, just like that, $20 billion of debt relief for African countries. That has been one of the biggest planks in their engagement with Africa. So we can talk about Russia in greater detail in a Q&A. So let me take 1 or 2 minutes to say 1 or 2 things about India. India is another country that has not fulfilled the expectations Africans had for that relationship. Much like Russia, India was a champion of African independence. So the question is, why did it not become one of Africa's key strategic partners? My perspective, one event really affected our relationship. And there was one event within India's own neighborhood. Back in 1962, if you recall, India and China had a bit of a border skirmish. And that basically forced India to retract back to its neighborhood. So the engagement between India and Africa has been very, very selective because of that. They had greater, bigger preoccupations in their own neighborhood. But India is in Africa. India is in Africa today because India needs Africa. By and large, it's about energy. It's about oil. India is one of the countries, one of the big countries that has, well, they haven't really had any major oil discoveries since the 1970s. India hasn't really discovered any oil. But India is growing at something like 5% per year in terms of economic growth. So to sustain that level of economic growth, you need energy. So India is looking to Africa to supply its economy with that very important commodity. But India is also in other parts of Africa doing other things beyond oil. They're involved in copper mining in Zambia. They're involved in iron ore mining in Liberia and Nigeria. Tata, a big Indian company, is everywhere in Africa. They're doing things like repairing or renovating hotels, putting together assembly plants, and so on and so forth. So, India is there, Russia is there, so is China. I think the biggest challenge for Africa, and it's something that we kind of been toying around or waltzing around that issue, is what are we going to do with this? What are we going to do with this interest? Or how are we going to manage this relationship? 50 years from now, when we look back at this period when all of these big countries had huge interest in dealing with Africa, what are we going to say? Are we going to say that we managed our relationship and here are the tangible results? Here are the tangible results that we derived from that relationship. Or are we, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, blame China for what they didn't do, blame India for what they did, blame Russia for this, that, or the other? How are we going to look back? And this depends on how we manage the relationship today. How much leverage are African countries bringing to the table? How much? This is not a rhetorical question. Actually, I want an answer. How much leverage are we bringing to the table? If we're not bringing any leverage to the table, why not? If we're not bringing any leverage to the table, what is it that we need to do to rectify this? The Chinese need Africa. The Russians need Africa. The Indians need Africa. That means that Africa is in a huge position of power, tremendous advantage. What are we doing to seize that? What are we going to do to seize that? My good friend here says, please conclude. I've already concluded. Thank you.